Welcome to the Constitutional Clarion. Today I'm going to talk to you about the 1898 referendum for the adoption of the Australian Constitution. Now, in the early 1890s, politicians from the various colonies in Australia had decided to come together to propose a federation and to draft a constitution to achieve that. The problem they had, however, was there was no agreement about what do you do once you've drafted the constitution. Is there any kind of mechanism for the approval of it? What actually do you do to make it happen? And so they drafted the constitution, but because there was disagreement about what further measures should be taken to adopt it, they just decided to leave it to each colony to decide whether or not it would accept this new constitution. Now, that went bad when in New South Wales there was a change of government. Sir Henry Parkes, often called the father of federation, was very much in favour of it, but he had lost office. And the new Premier of New South Wales, George Reid, who was later known as Yes No Reid because of his ambivalence towards federation, was initially not terribly keen on it. Equally, the Labor Party was a new force, a new political force, and it wasn't keen on federation either because it was concerned that federation would mean that the workers of New South Wales could be oppressed by, for example, a national military. So Labor not keen on it, Conservatives not keen on it either because they were concerned about the financial aspects of it and that New South Wales would effectively pick up the bill. So because New South Wales didn't proceed with it, and New South Wales was the colony with the biggest number of the biggest population, it just fell into a black hole and federation was not going to proceed. Now, federation was actually then revived by a people's movement. And this was people in federation leagues, often along the border between the various colonies, and in particular along the Murray River, because people had to pay taxes on goods as they crossed the river because they were moving from one colony to another, and one colony might impose a tax on particular goods coming into it. So the people along the Murray River thought it would be better if we had one large colony with a free trade zone within it, and that would mean we didn't have to pay tax every time we got goods from the other side of the border. So, a lovely romantic story, Australia's federation largely based on people who didn't like paying tax. Very Australian, really. Anyway, so what then happened was these federation leagues proposed a conference which was held in Corowa, and at that conference they decided that they should instead this time start off with a plan that involved not only a start but a finish, so that you had the entire process from beginning to end all set out in legislation before you started. And it was going to be a more democratic process. So the first thing they were going to do was to get people to vote, to elect people to the Constitutional Convention, which would then write the new constitution. And then at the end of that process, there would be a referendum in each of the colonies to adopt the constitution. And that would be the process by which it was approved. After that, however, it would then be sent off to the United Kingdom to be enacted. So the Westminster Parliament was still involved. But the internal Australian process would be highly democratic with this inbuilt referendum. So that's what was proposed, and the idea was each of the colonies would enact legislation that would deal with the entire process from beginning to end. Well, it sort of worked. So 4 of the colonies agreed to enact that legislation. So that was New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. Western Australia, which was still pretty new to the whole idea of democracy, wasn't keen on the idea of the referendum yet. They wanted to make sure that the Western Australian Parliament approved it first. They also disagreed with electing the representatives to the Constitutional Convention and said, no, we want to appoint them. So Western Australia did things differently. Queensland, you might ask, what happened there? Well, they didn't turn up at all. Why not? Well, they were having their own internal fight about whether they were going to be one colony or three. So there was a lot of internal issues in Queensland about whether to separate into three different colonies. So they didn't even bother turning up to the 1897, 1898 constitutional conventions. But there was a further complication because people said, well, look, this idea of a referendum is all well and good if it really does represent the views of the people, but because there was no compulsory voting, what if there's a really low turnout and we get a result in that referendum that doesn't actually represent the views of a majority of the voters? So they said, well, look, what we're going to say is that for the referendum to pass, there has to be a minimum number of voters voting in favour of it. And so you'd have to have a majority overall, but also meet that minimum number of voters. So Victoria and New South Wales put that in their legislation and said you had to have a minimum of 50,000 people voting in favour. Tasmania did that. They had far fewer people there, so more particularly enfranchised people there. They had a fairly restrictive franchise. So their minimum number was 6,000. South Australia, being a lot more liberal and having had that experience of a previous referendum, said, no, we're not going to put any restriction on it at all. So just majority rules. You know, whoever turns up to vote, the majority will decide it. And later, and this is quite critical, in New South Wales, in the Parliament, the people who were opposed to federation decided to make it even harder by upping that minimum amount from 50,000 to 80,000 people. So you had to have 80,000 to prove it in New South Wales in order for this referendum to pass. All right, so we then had the constitutional conventions and we had a new constitution drafted. So this is following up from an earlier draft in 1891. They did a new draft, somewhat based on the earlier one, but with some significant changes. And then we got to the point of putting this to the people in a referendum. So there was a campaign. The campaign was, again, quite contested. Again, from both the left and the right, there was opposition. So on the right, there was still a concern that this was going to lead to significant increases in tax. So one of the provisions in the Constitution said that at the Commonwealth level, if you impose taxes, it has to be equal across the board in all the states. And the concern was that if you're going to have an equal level of taxation, but you're going to need to support some of those poorer states that don't have a lot of money, then the amount is going to be higher and the people of New South Wales were going to be paying unnecessarily high rates of tax. That was the argument anyway. From the left, it was still concerns, particularly amongst the Labor Party, that workers would be oppressed. There was concern by the Socialist Alliance that the system was undemocratic to the extent that in the Senate, each of the various states would have equal representation, and that wasn't adequately representing the people. So, you know, if the people of Tasmania had an equal number of representatives as the people in the much more populous New South Wales, it was going to be unfair. So there were arguments that the process and that the proposed federation was going to be undemocratic because it was more focused on representing states in the upper house rather than representing people. So those were the arguments that were made. As you can imagine, newspapers produced fairly inflammatory stories. There were bombshell stories in the Daily Telegraph all the time opposing federation. One of the arguments, one of the things that the Daily Telegraph argued was that the reason Victorians were in support of federation was so that they could plunder New South Wales. So the Daily Telegraph tried to create enmity between different colonies in order to undermine the vote for federation. So we come to the actual vote. Now, the people who'd been in favour of federation, so people like Edmund Barton, who became the first Prime Minister, and Robert Garran and Bernard Wise and the like, they all went to, they hired a room in a pub which was across the road from the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, why did they do that? Well, the Sydney Morning Herald had a big board put up outside the newspaper with the votes coming in being recorded on that board. And there's a marvellous photo, which if I can, I will include, which shows all the people standing outside in the street watching this board. And so you had Edmund Barton and his friends in a room above, in a pub, desperately watching as the numbers ticked over. They could see that the yes side was winning. It was certainly more than the no side, but would they get the magic 80,000 number? And so they watched, and the excitement grew, and then finally it ticked over to 80,000, and they thought, hooray, we've won, and the crowds were cheering, and everybody was terribly excited because they could see this was a new era with all these colonies coming together to create this one great colony of Australia, which would become a nation in the future. And then, in the midst of their excitement, the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald came over and knocked on the door. And what did he say? He said, I'm really sorry, but we've made a mistake and we've double counted some of the votes. And in fact, there were only 71,595 votes in favour of federation. And while it was still more than those opposed, so 66,228 said no, it didn't hit the 80,000 mark. And he said, what should I do? And one of the people there said, well, if you want to maintain the windows in your building, I suggest you wait till everybody goes home before you tell them it was all a mistake. So there you have it. It was a mistake. And the 1898 referendum did not succeed in New South Wales because even though a majority of voters there voted for it, it didn't hit the 80,000 mark. And if you look at the overall figures as well, those four, if you count all the four colonies in which a referendum was held, so that's New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, those for federation were 219,712, with those against being only 108,363. So basically almost double, in fact more than double those were in favour than against. But simply because it failed in New South Wales, with New South Wales having the biggest population, it really meant that federation was not going to succeed, at least at that point. There was going to need to be some changes and another referendum. And that is a matter for another video. See you next time. Thank you.